Welcome back to Cheche. Today's guests are David Ndii, head of NASA's Technical Committee, and Ababu Namwamba, head of the Labour Party of Kenya, which is affiliated with the Jubilee Party. And so, David Ndii, thank you for joining us. We apologize for asking you to join us rather late. So to bring you up to speed, we have talked about, and the conversation is framed around political versus public interest. And we started by asking Ababu Namwamba about this feeling that political parties such as the one you work with don't really care about the public interest of Kenyans. How would you respond to that?
Let me start by pointing out that I work for a coalition of political parties.
Fair enough. Which gives you a broader range from which
fine.
to...
Just to make a point, coalitions are a bit different from single parties because they conglomerate much broader interests. And in fact, are more likely to be aligned with bigger interests than one party. More fundamentally, I think the question one has to ask, what is the overriding public interest at this point in time? And our sense of the overriding public interest is that we had an election, and the institution which manages that election was found to have completely subverted the presidential election. But we then have a situation that, in such a situation, the Constitution requires that we have a fresh election after 60 days. But that election has to be conducted then by the same institution that which was found culpable for what the court called illegalities and irregularities. Now, in our experience, what has happened since is that we began engaging that institution to see how a free and fair election, fresh election, that meets the constitutional standard, as was clearly ruled by the Supreme Court, could be held. And we thought we were making progress in that conversation. But what seems to be happening, and it shouldn't be strange, is that you know from our history that when elections have gone horribly wrong, they have consumed the institution that conducts them. The 2007 election consumed Kivuitu's ECK. We had another body called the IIEC, and now this is the third reincarnation. And it seems that the IEBC is also being consumed by what it has done. In fact, having gone for a retreat over the weekend after some of the events we saw last week, the IEBC came back. We tried to engage them yesterday.
By events, you mean that the attempts to suspend or sideline?
Or the internal, right. The internal struggles between, I think, the commission, some parts of the commission, which was trying to move forward and respond to the situation, and some part of the commission which was trying to claw back, and maybe also the staff, and to not confront the enormity of what they are been found culpable and responsible for. They have come back with complete amnesia. Yeah? And the conversation now has nothing to do with all the things that happened. They wrote a document which they have called the status update. That document has erased everything about the illegalities and the irregularities and accountability for the action. They have stated that the same people who conducted the election will contact, and the document now goes into the sort of bureaucratic processes of printing ballots, of training people, and there is clearly no intention to face up. This could be for two reasons, to my mind. It could be because of external pressure, but it also could be because of internal sort of psychological coping mechanism. You know, sometimes when you do something of a very enormous magnitude, people are unable to deal with it, and they therefore go into denial and pretend it didn't happen. So we cannot say for sure. So what we face is a situation that a free and fair election, or an election which meets the constitutional standard, may not be possible. in the next 35 days or so.
What does that mean, therefore, that there will be no election?
Probably there will be no election. I think we have to contemplate that there will be no election.
Why?
Because there cannot be an election if the same body wants to conduct exactly the same election is conducted.
So who should do it?
That is a conversation we should be having. So when you're asking what the
law says only the IBC can do it.
Absolutely.
So
the law says, that is why I said, what is the overarching public interest? The overarching public interest is to how the nation can resolve this political crisis. If we do not resolve it, it will precipitate a constitutional crisis. And that's the conversation we have been trying to have.
But an election will take place because the IEBC is a body, as Mutegi says, mandated by the Constitution to hold the election. Yes. I think what will happen is that NASA, for its own reasons, reasons which you're outlining, might choose not to participate in the election. You have said no reform, no election. But those are two very different things.
Yeah. Does it mean if NASA doesn't participate, then there is no election?
I think you asked what the overarching national interest.
And we'll come back to that because you have conflated national interest with NASA's interest.
No, the overarching public interest is to resolve the political crisis. NASA is one half of the political equation. Jubilee is the other half of the political equation. The overarching interest is to do what is in the best for the country. Now, the best for the country, I think the framework for what is the best for the country is that we are a constitutional republic. And I think the overarching goal of a constitutional republic at this point in time is to institutionalize democracy and the rule of law. So if you say that what we want is a pragmatic thing which glosses over fundamental rule of law issues, fundamental accountability issues, sweep those under the rug, we are not addressing the public interest.
Ababu, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I'm actually very happy that Dr. is here. He can be able to get a few clarifications on some of the views he holds dear. But I'm also happy that Dr. is talking about overarching public interest, the Constitution, fidelity to the Constitution. And it will be interesting to hear from the technical advisor to NASA what their view is on some of the very fundamental elements of our Constitution. One of which I want to pick from Article 249 of the Constitution about commissions, because we are talking about a commission here. And part of the so-called overarching public interest should really be the integrity and the sanctity of the institution that the Constitution establishes. Because when you talk about overarching public interest, you should also be asking whose interest? Is it NASA's interest? Is it the interest of all Kenyans? Is it the interest of the nation? Is it the interest of the minority over the majority? Whose interest exactly?
Okay, so go ahead.
Article 249, commissions and the holders of independent offices are subject only to this Constitution and the law, and are independent and not subject to direction or control by any person or authority. This is a fundamental constitutional principle, that the IEBC is only, number one, subject to the Constitution, and should not be subjected to the control or direction of any other authority.
And the point you're trying to make is that NASA has tried to control and direct them.
NASA has tried every rule in the book before and after elections to undermine this constitutional body. You will recall that in the build-up to the August 8th elections, NASA did everything humanly possible to undermine the authority over the IEBC. They filed case after case, case after case. They tried to sabotage the printing of ballot papers. They tried to do everything humanly possible. So it is not new. What NASA is doing right now is not new. But then the other point I would want to put to
Dr.
Ndii is NASA's interpretation of the Constitution. Before he walked in, we were talking about incumbency.
Temporary incumbency.
Yeah, because there is the NASA has made it clear, and his principles in their favorite political sport of Kibra yesterday, went on and on of how, oh, Uhuru is not president, oh, Uhuru should not address the official opening of the National Assembly. Uhuru has got no presidential authority. I want Dr. Ndi, a well-schooled gentleman, to tell me from this constitution where NASA is reading those provisions. Which constitution is NASA reading when they say the president, for instance, offended the law by addressing the official opening of Parliament yesterday? And therefore, when I hear Dr. Ndi talk about overarching public interest, I cannot help but wonder whose public interest. And I want to repeat this.
So that's quite a bit that he needs to
I want to repeat this before he responds. We cannot create a scenario in this country where the minority seek to dominate the will of the majority. That would be turning every tenet of democracy as we know it upside down, and it's not acceptable.
Okay, Dr. Ndi.
Let me start with the IBC and independence of institutions. Institutions fail quite often, as individuals do. So the fact that the institution is constitutional doesn't mean that if it fails, the country does not deal with it. If you recall, we started very early on last year by pointing out that the previous commission had been caught up in a huge corruption scandal, and we initiated political processes to remove it out of office. It was initially resisted by Jubilee. Eventually we succeeded. We had a bipartisan process of appointing a new commission so as to create an environment for free and fair, level the playing field. We instituted a lot of, not a lot, but process reforms as well, which we agreed in a bipartisan manner. Those are the ones which were supposed to conduct this election, particularly the results transmission process, the electronic. We had used this before in 2013, but they had been failed by people. So we made them law and tried to make it ensure that that they do not fail this time. So the idea that institutions should be left out there on their own, ultimately the country has to come together and politically and ask what institutions do we need, and that role belongs to Parliament. So having done that, I think you saw also Jubilee trying to backtrack on those reforms with the so-called amendments that Duale took to Parliament, manual backup. Parliament was subjected to harassment. We saw APCs, those sort of police vehicles outside Parliament, something unprecedented in this country. And ultimately, it is in fact the fact that it became very difficult to subvert the election using that process, the structure that had been put in place, that what we are seeing is that the electoral tallying and transmission and process was taken completely outside the system. Yeah? So the system wasn't used. If you follow the memo that the chairman wrote to his CEO, the show cause memo, and you look at all the questions which were asked, they show a complete subversion of the technology. Things were switched off. Servers which were supposed to be secure were made accessible to other people. Technology, which is a security architecture, which was designed by reputable companies, IBM and Oracle, and for which we paid a fair amount of money, 300 million shillings, I think, was not used. It was sort of avoided. So when we start talking about constitution and institutions and things in an abstract manner, I think those are fundamental governance failures.
So that's the background. I think
that need to be confronted and addressed. Yeah.
Dr. Ndi, is that you have this irreducible minimums that NASA says must happen before October 17th, before a fresh election is taken. Doesn't that constitute directing the IEBC, doing the IEBC, compromising, doing the IEBC job and compromising their independence?
We are not speaking to the IEBC alone. We are stakeholders in the election. And if you go back to that constitution, it talks about all public processes being participatory and all of that as a fundamental sort of spirit of the way we conduct our public affairs. So calling people to a table to discuss a problem that we have, and we surely cannot be faulted for saying that the election should be free and fair and should enjoy the confidence of all the players. And if we are telling people, let's come and talk about this, and that is being called interference. IEBC approached us first. The very first time last Monday, they told they wanted to come and see us. So we said, we should come, you can come, but we have an experience of engaging you, and you don't discuss things in good faith, so everything we do should be structured and written. So we wrote back to them, and thus began a process of correspondence. So we have done everything above board, in writing, in a structured manner. So the idea that we are directing the IBC, we have no power to direct the IBC, but we are saying...
we are saying Ezra Chiloba must go. If
we are saying,
no election.
We are saying there are, who was responsible for, we are following. We did not say Ezra Chiloba must go. In fact, if you look at what we have said, we have given an even long list of officers.
So you're talking about the formal engagements, not what we see in political rallies.
Yeah, we have a formal engagement. Everything is in writing.
I have what you have in writing, the reducible minimums, complicit election personnel, officers who facilitated the display of figures purporting them to be results, etc. These officers include the Commissioner, Jubilee, and number 2, Ezra Chiloba. They should be barred from participating in the fresh elections. And then you go on to give a list of others. So you're saying that there's a difference between what we've been seeing in the press, Chiloba must go, versus what we're seeing here in your irreducible minimums.
In fact, I think we have, that document was the proposal we were to discuss yesterday.
And which you walked out of.
Which they did not, they sort of treated us very shabbily. They had a document which was avoiding all those issues. So in fact, one of the reasons...
This is the status update you're talking
about. Yeah, this is the status update. So one of the reasons that I am late is because I was actually drafting the response, which includes some of the things that you're reading. So we do have a formal, structured process of engagement going on. And I think we have not seen Jubilee putting on the table their own proposals of what we need to do to ensure that we have a free and fair election.
So I'll come to Ababu because you've been wanting to speak, but I'd ask you first, is there any merit to NASA's frustrations of some of these individuals, the demand that they should not be associated with the fresh election?
And even as you respond to that, the law provides explicitly for action to be taken against those who contravene the electoral laws. What is the position of Jubilee as we head to October 17th?
Let me first of all say that the propensity for doublespeak in the NASA ranks is mind-boggling.
Okay, so you're both academics. We have 10 minutes, so all I'm asking you
very quickly,
condense your
that the NASA principals would stand in Kibra yesterday, Raila Odinga, Moses Wetangula, and say Chiloba must go. And you can play that clip here. And then David Ndi comes here and attempts to sugarcoat that and say, no, it's not about Chiloba, that is political, and then there is formal engagement. Really, that is dishonest.
I'm sorry,
and then let me conclude this, because I allowed you absolute space to air your views. And again, you say that when institutions collapse, we revert to the Constitution and use institutions such as Parliament. So you want Parliament to lead us in sorting out what you consider to be the mess. This is the same Parliament that NASA says has been constructed or constituted unconstitutionally. And in fact, NASA claims that the so-called majority of Jubilee in the House is a mirage. Now, David Ndii again says, if we are having a problem with any of these institutional, constitutional issues, we revert back to Parliament. How do you deal with this kind of doublespeak? How do you deal with this kind of insincerity and inconsistency?
Okay, so that's your point about doublespeak.
The point I'm saying is that, yes.
Do you see any merit to NASA asking that officers they felt, electoral officers they felt, sabotaged the election, not be allowed to have a hand in the October 17th election, particularly, as you've been reminded by Charles, within the law, there are penalties for those electoral offences?
My position is very clear. The Supreme Court rendered a determination, a verdict, and they promised to give a reasoned, detailed judgment, which we are all looking forward to. That judgment is going to provide in minute detail any grounds for culpability of any individual. In the absence of those details, really everything else at this stage is conjecture.
So that
what I know...
The same ruling will also provide for exactly what went wrong that needs to be addressed before we move to October 17th.
It will provide a basis for any further action. What I know is that the Supreme Court found that there were irregularities in the presidential election and ordered the institution constitutionally mandated to preside over that election to proceed and prepare for another election in 60 days. That institution, in my plain, simple reading of the Constitution, is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. And just to clarify that, in the event, because NASA has talked secession, I would like to hear this business of secession and whether that is in the overarching public interest. NASA has talked numbers. NASA has talked all these issues. They are even talking the possibility of there not being election. But I want to clarify here that the Constitution contemplates a lot of these scenarios. And Article 138 is very clear. If only one candidate for president is nominated, that candidate shall be declared elected. And so, whether or not NASA participates in this election, there will be a process by dint of the Constitution through operation of Article 138 of the Constitution.
Dr. Ndii should get the last word. And those are several points that have been raised.
And this memo, by the way, this memo, in our circles, we believe that this memo, this so-called memo, first of all, this memo? This memo that Dr. Ndii has quoted.
The IBC...
The so-called memo from...
The 12-point memo.
Yes.
The show-cause memo.
Yes, show-cause memo. That memo, in my view, is not wholly writ. That memo is seeking clarification. And so to sit here... You've used
the legal term for the benefit of our viewers?
Not a holy writ.
It's not gospel truth.
Yes.
So that you sit here and say, on the basis of this memo, we indict officer so-and-so. Okay. In fact,
so
there are very strong fears amongst our ranks that this memo originated from NASA.
Okay. So, yes. Okay. Dr. Ndii, please respond to those, and those will be your closing remarks as we wind up the show.
We are hurtling towards a political crisis in this country. This sort of situation we are in precipitates political crisis in many countries, including civil wars.
Which NASA seems to want.
Let me give an example.
NASA really wants a civil war.
This is the situation that the DRC is in as we speak. Okay?
Occasioned by multiple postponements of elections.
Multiple postponements of elections, all sorts of things. People trying to stick to power after their terms have expired. I think Burundi is comparable.
But in this case, nobody is trying to stick to power.
It's a constitution.
I said about those countries. So let us be alive to that. This program is about overarching public interest. So the overarching public interest is to resolve a political crisis. That political crisis is inherent in the events that happened on the 8th. The fact that a body that is charged to conduct elections aborted an election, yet it is the same body which is required to conduct that election in 60 days, and may in fact implode institutionally.
The other side feels that it is NASA which
Mutegi, Charles, Ababu, we're out of time.
I think feelings here are not useful, are not helpful. What the situation itself is, the facts are whatever. The situation is that is the situation. And it will not be changed by burying our heads in the sand and trying to make things look like business as usual, because you have two sides to this coin. We are being quite open and public about what our stand is on this issue. We are not going to budge on constitutionalism, democracy, and rule of law. We are not going to budge on the institutionalization of sham elections like we see in a lot of our neighbors, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda. Everybody, I think, looks at people who want that to be the norm in Kenya. We are not going to budge. And so if we are not going to budge, and other people are not going to come to the table, then this political crisis is going to continue. Okay.
And so that's all we have time for this morning. Our guests today were David Ndii, head of NASA's Technical Committee team, and Ababu Namwamba, head of the Labour Party of Kenya, which is affiliated with the Jubilee Party. We thank you for your time this morning. We can see that we ran out of time for a fairly deep conversation about the competing interests in the country. We think that the conversation will continue on social media. So our thanks also to our panelists, Mutegi Njau and Charles Othiambo. My name is Udwaka Mimo. Thank you for watching Cheche. We will see you next week.